I found my son sitting on the concrete floor of an abandoned municipal pump station, his back against a rusted control panel, blood dried neatly along his collar. The emergency lights were still on, humming softly, as if nothing unusual had happened. He looked up at me and said, very calmly, "She signed the report anyway." Then he asked me to lock the door behind us. That was the moment I understood that everything I trusted, my work, my family, my name, was already being used against us. I did not expect to find my son there. No one ever goes to the old pump station anymore. The city decommissioned it years ago, after the river was rerouted and the new system came online. It sits at the edge of the floodplain, concrete sunk into mud, half swallowed by weeds and time. The gate is usually locked. That night, it was open. I remember noticing the sound first, a low electrical hum, steady and patient, like a refrigerator in an empty house. The emergency lights were on inside, casting a dull, red glow through the cracked doorway. I parked my car crookedly on the gravel and walked in without calling his name. I do not know why I did not call out. Something in me already knew that noise would not help. My son was sitting on the floor with his back against the control panel. His legs were stretched out in front of him, one shoe missing, the other soaked dark at the toe. There was blood on his shirt, dried and tidy, as if someone had wiped around it carefully. His face was swollen on one side, but his eyes were open, clear, watching me the way he did when he was a child and trying not to cry. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hum filled the space between us. Then he said, very calmly, "You should lock the door." I stepped back and did it. The latch clicked louder than it should have. When I turned around again, he was still watching me, his breathing shallow but controlled. That was when I noticed his hands. They were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from effort. He was holding himself together. "What happened?" I asked. He swallowed and shifted his head against the metal panel. "She signed the report anyway." That was all he said. No names, no explanation. Just that sentence, dropped between us like it belonged there. I knelt in front of him and took his face gently in my hands, the way I had when he was small and feverish. His skin was cold, too cold. I checked his pupils, then the side of his head, then his ribs. I had not done field assessments in years, not since I retired from the county office, but habits do not leave you. They wait. "Can you stand?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not yet." "Did anyone see you?" "No." "Did you call anyone?" "No." He looked past me then, at the door, at the narrow line of light where the concrete met rust. "I didn't want them to know you'd come." That was the moment fear finally arrived. Not panic, fear with edges. I took off my coat and wrapped it around his shoulders. He did not protest. When I touched his wrist, I felt the swelling immediately. Something was broken, maybe more than one thing. I pressed my forehead briefly to his and closed my eyes, just long enough to steady myself. "I'm here," I said. "I've got you." He nodded once, trusting. He has always trusted me, even when he shouldn't have. I am not a dramatic person. I spent most of my life working in municipal compliance, reviewing zoning variances, environmental impact statements, safety certifications, paperwork, meetings. People assumed it was dull. It wasn't. Power leaves fingerprints. You learn to recognize them when you spend years reading what people don't want read. I raised my son alone after his father died. He was 12. I taught him to check facts twice, to write things down, to never assume the system was on your side just because it existed. He grew up practical, careful, kind in a quiet way. He became a civil engineer, specialized in infrastructure assessments, bridges, water systems, public works, the kind of work no one notices unless it fails. He married into a family that notices everything, or pretends to. We did not talk much after his wedding, not because of distance, but because every conversation felt supervised. His wife, Marianne, was always nearby, pleasant, organized. Her mother, Elaine, was something else. She chaired boards. She hosted fundraisers. Her name was attached to plaques and press releases. She spoke about community the way some people speak about weather, as something that exists to be managed. I never liked the way she looked at my son, as if he were a useful addition rather than a person. Still, I told myself I was being unfair. Mothers can be territorial. I had no proof of anything, just a feeling I learned long ago not to ignore, but often did anyway. "Mom," he said now, pulling me back. "You need to listen carefully. I am. There's a secondary file. Not in the city database. It's physical. I made copies." "Where?" He hesitated, just a second too long. "They might already be gone." My stomach tightened. "Who is they?" He looked at me then, really looked, as if measuring how much he could say without breaking something fragile. "People who don't want the river touched." The river. Of course, 3 months ago, the city announced a redevelopment plan along the South Bank. Mixed-use housing, retail, a riverwalk. It had been stalled for years because of contamination concerns. Then suddenly, it was approved. Clean bill of health, all safety checks passed. I had read the summary. Something about it bothered me, but I told myself it was not my problem anymore. It was his. "I found discrepancies," he said. "Sediment samples that were logged but never tested. Pressure data that didn't match the equipment. A contractor who signed off on inspections he couldn't have performed. And you reported it." "Yes." "To whom?" "To the Oversight Committee." I exhaled slowly. "And Elaine?" His mouth tightened. "She chairs it." I did not say anything. I did not need to. "She called me into a private meeting," he continued. "Said there were political considerations, timelines, jobs at stake. She told me I was being rigid." That word again. The one people use when they mean inconvenient. "I refused to amend my findings," he said. So she reassigned the review. Then last week, the report was finalized, with my name still on it. My hands curled into fists before I noticed. "She forged your approval." She didn't have to. She just signed hers over it. And tonight, he closed his eyes. I went to retrieve the original samples, the ones stored off-site. I thought, if I could prove. "Someone followed you," I finished. "Yes." The hum seemed louder now. The light flickered once, then steadied. "She didn't come herself," he said. "She wouldn't." "No," I agreed. "She wouldn't." He shifted, a sharp breath escaping him. "They told me this was a warning, that accidents happen around old infrastructure, that no one would question it." My chest burned, not with rage yet, with something colder. I checked his phone. Battery removed. Good. I pulled mine out and did the same. We did not need signals. We needed time. "We're leaving," I said. "Not the hospital," he said quickly. "Please." I met his eyes. I understood immediately why he was afraid. A hospital would mean reports. Reports would mean questions. Questions would be redirected, buried, softened. He would become a problem to be managed. "I won't take you anywhere you're not safe," I said. "But we're not staying here." Outside, the wind moved through the reeds along the riverbank. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn sounded. Ordinary life, moving along its tracks. I helped him to his feet slowly. He leaned heavily on me, but he did not complain. As we moved toward the door, I noticed something small on the floor near the panel. A plastic badge clip, broken, not his. I did not pick it up. I did not comment on it. I simply remembered it. When we reached the door, he stopped me. "Mom," he said, "if anything happens." "Nothing is happening," I said. "Not tonight." He nodded, but I could see the doubt behind his eyes. Doubt planted carefully by people who knew exactly where to press. As I unlocked the door and guided him into the night air, I felt something settle inside me. Not fear, not anger, recognition. This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a decision made by people who believed the ground itself would protect them. They were wrong, and they were about to find out how much damage a quiet woman with nothing left to lose could do. simply by telling the truth in the right order. I drove with one hand on the wheel and the other steady on my son's knee, feeling the subtle tremor in his muscles every time the car hit a crack in the road. I took back streets, the kind I used to drive when I wanted to avoid meetings and phone calls, routes that wound through older neighborhoods and industrial pockets the city had stopped caring about. The river stayed to our left, invisible in the dark, but I could sense it the way you sense a presence in a room even with your eyes closed. He kept his head back against the seat, eyes shut now, jaw tight. Every so often he exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, as if counting. I recognized that habit. He learned it from me during the years after his father died, when grief came in waves and you either learned to breathe through it or drowned. We did not go home. Home was too obvious. We went to my old place on the north side, the one I kept after retirement and never quite let go of. A narrow brick duplex, squeezed between a shuttered laundromat and a church that only opened on Sundays. I still paid the utilities, old habits, again. I helped him inside and settled him on the couch. The lamplight showed me things I did not like. Bruising spreading under the skin, a shallow cut at the hairline, swelling along his ribs. I worked quietly, methodically, the way I always had. Ice. Compression. A temporary splint fashioned from a folded magazine and duct tape I found in the kitchen drawer. He watched me with that same steady look, the one that told me he was scared but choosing not to be helpless. "You don't have to do this alone," he said at one point. "I'm not," I replied. "I'm doing it with you." That satisfied him. He closed his eyes again. While he rested, I moved through the apartment, checking windows, locks, the back door. Everything was as I left it, dust where it should be, silence that felt earned. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, hands resting on the counter, and let myself think. My name is Eleanor Price. I am 61 years old. For 34 years, I worked for the city of Rockford as a compliance officer, then senior reviewer. I signed off on zoning approvals, environmental impact statements, safety certifications for projects that reshaped neighborhoods and rerouted lives. People assumed I was part of the machinery. They were wrong. My job was to read what others skimmed and ask questions no one wanted answered. I learned early that power rarely announces itself. It hides in footnotes, in amended language, in signatures added late in the process when everyone is tired and wants to go home. I also learned that the most dangerous people are not loud. They are calm, certain. They believe they are entitled to outcomes. I raised my son, Daniel, to believe that facts matter, that systems can be bent, but not broken, if you apply pressure in the right place. He believed me. He still does. That is why he is lying on my couch, instead of pretending nothing happened. His wife's family built their reputation on pretending nothing happened. Elaine Walker made her career out of restoration, old neighborhoods, old waterways, old promises. She spoke about renewal the way preachers speak about salvation, as if it were both a gift and a judgment. People admired her certainty. I saw something else, a woman who did not like being told no. I had watched her once, years ago, during a public hearing. A young hydrologist stood at the podium, voice shaking, explaining why a proposed development would destabilize the riverbank. Elaine smiled the entire time. When he finished, she thanked him, then dismantled his argument with 3 sentences and a joke. The board laughed. The project passed. 2 years later, that section of the bank collapsed during heavy rain. No one died. The report called it unforeseen. Daniel knew that story. He still went to work every day believing he could do his job honestly. That is not naivete. That is courage. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote things down. Times, dates, names he had mentioned, oversight committee members, contractors. I did not know yet what I would do with the list. Writing steadied me. It always had. Near dawn, Daniel woke and asked for water. His voice was hoarse. I handed him a glass and watched his hands. Still shaking, but less now. "They're going to say I overreacted," he said quietly, "that I misunderstood the data." "Let them," I said. "Data doesn't misunderstand itself." He managed a small smile. Then it faded. There's something else. I waited. They didn't just want the report changed, he said. They wanted me to disappear from the process. Elaine told me this project needed continuity. That dissent would confuse the public. It's where. And when you didn't agree? She said she was disappointed. Like I'd failed a test I didn't know I was taking. I felt a familiar anger then. Not hot. Focused. The kind that comes when you recognize a pattern you have seen before. Where are the copies? I asked. At the office, he said. In my old locker. I didn't trust the servers. Smart. Who knows? Just me. Good. He shifted, wincing. Mom, if you get involved, I already am. He looked at me for a long moment, then he nodded. He had always known this would not end with him staying quiet. After he fell asleep again, I went into the bedroom and pulled a box from the back of the closet. Inside were notebooks, old calendars, and a small address book I had not used in years, names I never erased, people who had once pushed back and paid for it, then found other ways to apply pressure. One name stood out, Thomas Reed, former state inspector. He left after his findings were overruled one too many times. We had not spoken in years, but I knew where to find him. I did not call yet. First, I listened, to the quiet of the apartment, to the city waking up outside, to the hum of traffic starting somewhere far away. By mid-morning, a news alert crossed my phone. A press release from the River Renewal Council. The redevelopment project was moving forward ahead of schedule. Groundbreaking ceremony announced. Elaine Walker quoted, praising cooperation and shared vision. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Then I turned the phone off. Daniel stirred on the couch, murmuring something unintelligible. I covered him with a blanket and sat back down at the table. I thought about how many times I had signed documents assuming the worst thing that could happen was a delayed permit or a budget overrun. I thought about how often I had told myself that if something was truly wrong, someone louder would intervene. I understood now how comfortable that belief had been. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. The system worked exactly as designed, and people like Elaine thrived inside it because most of us preferred order to truth. I picked up my pen again and added one more line to my list. Groundbreaking date. I did not know yet how this would end. I only knew that by signing her name where it did not belong, Elaine Walker had crossed a line she believed was invisible. She was about to learn that some signatures do not fade, no matter how carefully you try to bury them. Daniel slept most of that day, his body finally giving in to what it had been holding back. I checked on him every hour, adjusting the ice pack, making him sip water, watching his breathing. By late afternoon, the swelling along his ribs had deepened into a dark, uneven bloom, and his wrist was stiff and angry despite the splint. He never complained. That worried me more than anything else. When he woke again, the light outside had softened into early evening. He asked for soup. I heated a can on the stove, listening to the low hiss of the burner, the ordinary sound grounding me. We ate in silence, him on the couch, me on the chair across from him, knees almost touching. You remember how I met Marianne? He said suddenly. I nodded. Of course I did. At a city-hosted infrastructure conference in Milwaukee, she worked in public relations for a regional development firm at the time. She had been charming, polished, the kind of person who remembered names and made eye contact just long enough to make you feel seen. She was assigned to Elaine's projects, he continued. At first, I thought that meant she understood the work, the details, the risks. And later? I asked. He hesitated, spoon hovering midair. Later, I realized she understood something else. What? How to make things sound inevitable. That was Marianne's gift. She never argued directly. She reframed. Delays became prudence. Objections became noise. When Daniel raised concerns at family dinners, she smiled sympathetically and suggested he was tired or stressed or too close to the work to see the bigger picture. She always said Elaine admired me, he said, that she respected my integrity. I said nothing. The night Elaine reassigned the review, he went on, Marianne told me it was a relief, that now we could stop fighting the tide. It's won. The spoon clinked softly against the bowl. I thought she meant the politics, he said. I didn't realize she meant me. I leaned forward then. Did she know about the samples? He shook his head. I don't think so. If she did, she would have told Elaine. That distinction mattered. Ignorance and loyalty are different things. One can be corrected, the other rarely is. Daniel's phone buzzed on the coffee table. We both looked at it without moving. Unknown number. I let it ring until it stopped. A moment later, a text came through. Hope you're feeling better. Elaine was very concerned when she heard you'd had an incident. Daniel closed his eyes. They're fishing, I said. Yes. Don't respond. I won't. I picked up the phone and turned it face down. Then I did something I had not planned to do yet. I reached for my own phone and turned it back on. There were messages waiting, 2 from former colleagues checking in, polite, vague. One from a local reporter I had known for years, asking if I had thoughts on the accelerated timeline for the river project. I did not reply to any of them. Instead, I opened my contacts and scrolled until I found the name I had been circling all day. Thomas Reed answered on the 3rd ring. Eleanor, he said, without surprise. I need to talk, I replied. I figured, he said. Where are you? At home. A pause. Which one? The north side. Another pause. Shorter this time. I can be there in an hour. When I hung up, Daniel was watching me. Who was that? Someone who knows how these things end if no one intervenes. He nodded slowly. Be careful. I am, I said. That's why I'm calling him. Thomas arrived just after sunset. He looked older than I remembered, leaner, with deeper lines at the corners of his eyes. He took in the room in a glance, his gaze lingering briefly on Daniel's injuries, then returned to my face. So, he said. Elaine Walker finally slipped. She didn't slip, I replied. She stepped. He sat down heavily. What do you have? Not enough, I said. Yet. Daniel explained what he had found, what was missing, what had been altered. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Daniel finished, he let out a long breath. They're rushing for a reason, he said. Once the ground is broken, everything becomes theoretical. I know, I said. Thomas leaned back. You realize this isn't just about the river. I do now. He nodded. That redevelopment unlocks adjacent parcels, tax abatements, long-term leases. Elaine isn't just protecting a project, she's protecting a chain. Daniel frowned. A chain to what? To people higher up than her, Thomas replied. People who don't like surprises. Silence settled between us. Not heavy. Focused. I want to see the originals, Thomas said. They're at Daniel's office. He looked at Daniel. You sure they're still there? Daniel hesitated. They were this morning. Thomas stood. Then we don't have much time. After he left, Daniel sat very still. Mom, he said. If this goes the way I think it might. I know, I said. It won't stop with paperwork. He nodded. They won't come for you the way they came for me. No, I agreed. They won't. That was not reassurance. It was strategy. Later that night, after Daniel fell asleep again, I stood by the window and watched headlights pass on the street below. Each car moved with purpose, people inside going where they expected to arrive safely. I wondered how many of them knew what sat beneath the riverbank they trusted not to move. I thought about Elaine's smile, the way she thanked people after overruling them, the way she spoke about legacy as if it were a gift she could bestow. Power, I had learned, does not fear opposition. It fears exposure, and for the first time since finding my son on that cold concrete floor, I allowed myself to believe that exposure was still possible. The story we had been told about the river, about progress, about cooperation, was carefully constructed, elegant, convincing. But stories, like structures, fail at their weakest point, and Elaine Walker had just shown us where hers was. Thomas did not return that night. That worried me. but I did not call. When you decide to step into something like this, you accept that silence can mean many things, and not all of them are bad. I stayed awake anyway, sitting in the chair by the window, listening to Daniel's breathing rise and fall behind me. Around 3 in the morning, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail. Marianne's voice, soft, careful. "Daniel, please call me. Elaine is asking questions. They're worried. Everyone is worried." I deleted it without listening twice. By morning, Daniel's fever had come down, but the bruising along his side had spread. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if each motion needed approval. I helped him to the bathroom and back, made him toast he barely touched. Outside, the city was bright and indifferent, as if the night had not happened. Thomas called just before noon. "They cleaned it out," he said. "Your son's locker is empty. The samples are gone." I am stunned. Daniel closed his eyes when I told him. "But," Thomas continued, "they missed something." "What?" I asked. "Chain of custody forms," he said. "Not the originals, carbon copies." I felt a spark then, small but real. "Where?" "Archive storage. No one ever checks it. They assume digital is enough." "Is it enough? For what they're doing?" He paused. "No. We met that afternoon at Thomas's place, a narrow ranch house on the edge of town. Daniel stayed behind, resting, watching the front window like a reflex he couldn't turn off. I hated leaving him, but this part required movement. Thomas spread the papers across his dining table. Yellowed forms, signatures, timestamps. I recognized the formatting immediately. I had approved hundreds like them over the years. "These prove the samples existed," he said, "that they were logged, transferred, and then disappeared." "And that Daniel didn't fabricate anything," I added. He nodded. "More than that. They show a pattern." I leaned closer. Same contractor, same secondary reviewer, same window of time, over and over. "This goes back years," I said quietly. "Yes," Thomas replied. "Before your son was involved, before Elaine chaired the committee." I straightened. "Then who started it?" He looked at me. "Who do you think trained her?" That was the moment the story shifted. Not outward, but deeper. What we were facing was not a single bad decision or even a single bad person. It was a culture that rewarded silence and punished interruption. "There's more," Thomas said. "I spoke to someone at the lab, off the record, and they were instructed not to retain physical samples past a certain date. Deviations were flagged." "Flagged how?" "Career-wise." I sat back. "So anyone who noticed learned to look away, or leave," he said. I thought of all the names I had seen over the years, quietly removed from committees, reassigned, retired early. At the time, it had seemed natural. Now it looked deliberate. "When is the groundbreaking?" Thomas asked. 2 weeks, I said. He exhaled. "That's tight." "It has to be," I replied. "Once construction starts, evidence gets buried, literally." He smiled grimly. "Always admired your clarity, Eleanor." I was head. On the drive back, I stopped at a red light and watched the river slide past the edge of downtown. Calm, controlled. It did not look dangerous. That was the point. When I returned to the apartment, Daniel was sitting up, pale but alert. He listened as I explained what we had found. "So they didn't just want to silence me," he said. "They wanted the record clean." "Yes. And if the river shifts after the build, then it becomes an act of nature." He closed his eyes. "People will get hurt." Yes, that word again. Clear. Undeniable. That evening, Marianne came by unannounced. I opened the door before she could knock a second time. She looked relieved to see me, then unsettled when she realized Daniel was behind me, watching. "Oh," she said, "you're home." "Yes," I replied. "So is your husband." She stepped inside, her gaze sweeping the room, landing briefly on his injuries before sliding away. "I didn't know he was hurt this badly," she said. "You knew he was hurt," Daniel replied. "You didn't ask how." She flinched. That's not fair. Isn't it? I asked. She sat down slowly. Elaine is worried about him, about you. Daniel laughed once, short and bitter. She's worried about timelines. Marianne's jaw tightened. You don't understand how much is riding on this. That's the problem, I said. We do. She looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing me for the first time not as a mother-in-law, but as an obstacle. You should let this go, she said. For everyone's sake. For whose? I asked. She did not answer. After she left, Daniel stared at the closed door. She chose, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. She did. That night, I pulled out an old notebook and began writing again. Names, dates, patterns. I was not building a case yet. I was building a map. Somewhere in the city, Elaine Walker believed she had contained the damage. That a reassigned review and a bruised engineer were enough to keep the river obedient. She did not yet understand that the most dangerous thing she had done was not the signing of a report or the silencing of a whistleblower. It was reminding me of who I used to be. And once remembered, that version of me did not forget. The next morning, I woke before Daniel did. The apartment was quiet in that thin, watchful way that comes just before dawn. I stood at the kitchen sink with a mug of coffee I barely touched and watched the street through the narrow window. Nothing unusual, a delivery truck idling, a woman walking a dog, normality moving forward. Unaware of how close it sometimes comes to fracture, Daniel woke with a sharp intake of breath when he tried to shift his weight. I was beside him immediately. Easy, I said. Don't rush it. He nodded, jaw clenched. I dreamed the river came into the living room. I did not tell him that I had dreamed the same thing weeks ago, long before any of this happened. Instead, I helped him sit up and handed him his pain medication. He swallowed it without comment. We ate quietly. Then I did something I had been circling for days. I picked up my phone and made a call I had hoped never to make. My sister, Ruth, answered on the second ring. You don't call unless something's wrong, she said. I need your help, I replied. A pause. Where are you? North side. Another pause, longer. I'll be there by noon. Ruth and I had not been close in years. She had left the city early, after our mother died, and built a life elsewhere. She had a gift for logistics and an intolerance for nonsense that made her difficult to live with and impossible to fool. She worked in emergency planning now, advising municipalities on worst-case scenarios most people preferred not to imagine. When she arrived, she took in Daniel's condition with one look and did not ask questions she already knew the answers to. This is not a hospital situation, she said. No, I agreed. It's also not sustainable, she continued. Someone is going to come looking. Yes. Good, she said. Then we plan accordingly. We moved that afternoon, quietly, carefully. I had kept the keys to my late father's place in Cedar Bluff, a small town 2 hours west where the river thinned and bent away from development. The house had been empty for years, sitting at the end of a gravel road with no neighbors close enough to notice arrivals or departures. Ruth drove Daniel in her car. I followed, checking mirrors, keeping to the speed limit. No one followed us, or if they did, they were very good at it. The house was, as I remembered, dusty, solid, still. We settled Daniel on the ground floor and opened windows to let the stale air out. Ruth walked the perimeter, checking sight lines, entrances, cell reception. This will do, she said. For now. That evening, Thomas joined us. He had more documents. Not proof yet, but direction. They're accelerating permits, he said. Not just this project. Adjacent ones. Creating noise, Ruth said. Distraction. Exactly, Thomas replied. If everything moves at once, no one tracks individual deviations. I listened, saying little. My mind was already moving ahead. They expect us to react emotionally, I said finally. To push publicly, to make noise. Thomas nodded. And when you do, they'll discredit you. Yes, I said. So we don't. Ruth raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking? We wait, I replied. And we document. Daniel shifted slightly, wincing. They're going to bury this. It is cries. Not if we let them build, I said. Structures create liability. The moment that ground moves, every signature becomes relevant. Ruth looked at me carefully. You're saying let it proceed. To a point, I said. Not enough to cause harm, enough to force accountability. Silence followed. Not disagreement, calculation. That night, after everyone else slept, I sat alone at the kitchen table and opened my notebook. I wrote one sentence and underlined it. They believe speed protects them. I slept lightly, listening to the sounds of an unfamiliar house. In the early morning, I heard a car slow on the road, then continue. My heart did not race. It had already learned its rhythm. Over the next days, we stayed quiet. No calls, no messages. Daniel rested and healed slowly. Ruth set up contingencies. Thomas fed us information through careful channels. And somewhere in the city, Elaine Walker stood at podiums and smiled for cameras, confident that momentum was on her side. She had no idea that the most dangerous phase was not the confrontation. It was the waiting. By the fourth day in Cedar Bluff, Daniel could walk short distances without leaning on the wall. His wrist was still immobilized, his ribs tender, but the fever had not returned. Healing was slow, uneven, but real. That mattered. You cannot fight for the truth if your body is still negotiating survival. Ruth established a routine immediately. Windows open at dawn, closed by mid-morning. Phones powered on only at set intervals, then off again. Groceries bought in cash from different places. It was not paranoia. It was discipline. She had spent years planning for floods, blackouts, chemical spills. This was simply another kind of emergency. Thomas came and went, never staying long. He brought updates, not reassurance. The contractor who handled the riverbank stabilization just pulled out, he said one afternoon, standing by the kitchen counter. Cited unforeseen conflicts. That's unusual, Daniel said. It is, Thomas replied. But they were asking questions. So now they're gone. Who replaced them? I asked. A subsidiary, he said. New name, same leadership. I wrote it down. Subsidiaries are how you move risk without moving responsibility. That evening, I made another call. One I had delayed, not out of fear, but out of respect for the consequences it would bring. Miriam Hale answered with the same calm voice I remembered from years ago. Eleanor, she said, I was wondering when you'd reach out. I need access, I replied. Not to publish. Not yet. To what? To memory, I said. Yours. Miriam had been an investigative reporter before moving into archival journalism, a quieter field that suited her patience. She understood patterns the way others understood headlines. She also understood restraint. Where are you? She asked. Not in the city. Good, she said. Neither am I. She arrived 2 days later, driving an unremarkable sedan, carrying a single bag and a box of old notebooks. She greeted Daniel gently, asked permission before sitting near him, and listened as he explained what he had found. This isn't new, she said when he finished. It's just your turn. She spread her notebooks on the table, pages marked with dates and names. River projects, she said. Highway expansions. Industrial rezoning. Always the same rhythm. An early warning. A reassignment. A report finalized under pressure. And the people who object? Ruth asked. Miriam tapped a page. They disappear from the conversation. Not harmed, just moved. I leaned in. What about Elaine Walker? Miriam smiled faintly. She learned from someone else. A man named Harold Knox. The name landed heavily. Knox had been a fixture years ago, a consultant, a fixer. He never held office but advised everyone who did. He retired, Ruth said. Officially, Miriam replied. Unofficially, he still mentors. Daniel frowned. So Elaine isn't the top. No, Miriam said. She's the face. In the Divorite, that distinction clarified everything. Over the next week, we worked quietly. Daniel reviewed maps and data, marking stress points along the riverbank. Ruth tracked timelines and jurisdictional overlaps. Thomas followed permit changes. Miriam dug through archives, pulling old stories that never ran, notes that never made it past editors. And I watched. I connected. I remembered. One evening, as the sun set low over the trees, Daniel looked up from a map. "They're going to announce Phase 2 early," he said. "How do you know?" I asked. He pointed to a notation. "This section can't support the load they're planning unless they reinforce it. That requires additional approval, which means they'll push it through quietly. Before anyone can object," Ruth said. "Yes." Miriam closed her notebook. "Then that's your window." I nodded. "Not to stop them, to reveal them," Thomas finished. That night, I stood outside alone, the air cool and clean. I thought about how many years I had believed my role ended at retirement. That stepping away meant stepping aside. I understood now that experience does not expire. It waits. Elaine Walker believed she was managing risk. Harold Knox believed he had seen every variation of resistance. Neither of them had accounted for patience, and patience, when paired with memory, is far more dangerous than anger. We were ready to let them take the next step, because that step would leave a mark they could not erase. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning, exactly as Daniel predicted. Phase 2 of the river redevelopment would begin immediately, ahead of schedule, justified by favorable conditions and new efficiency measures. Elaine Walker stood in front of a backdrop of water and sky, smiling with practiced ease, speaking about momentum and opportunity. We watched the press conference on a muted laptop in the kitchen. No one spoke while she talked. We had all learned that listening mattered more. "There," Daniel said quietly, pointing to a rendering on the screen. "That retaining wall. It doesn't exist yet." "And it won't," Ruth added. "Not before they pour. They're counting on the river behaving," Thomas said. "It won't," Daniel replied. "Not with arrogance, with certainty." The room felt smaller then, not with fear, but with the weight of consequence. Up until that point, everything had been preparation, observation, pattern recognition. Now the line between knowledge and responsibility was thinning. "They're going to claim adaptive management," Miriam said. "If anything shifts, they'll say it was unpredictable. Unless someone proves it was predicted," I said. Daniel looked at me. "That's where the secondary file comes in, the one that was gone." "Not just that," I replied. "The chain of custody forms, the archive deviations, and something else." I reached for my notebook and slid it across the table. "Deaths," I said. Ruth frowned. "What?" "Not accidents," I clarified. "Consequences. Flooded basements, structural failures. A construction worker injured 3 years ago during a river-adjacent project. It was ruled a site error." Miriam's eyes sharpened. "I remember that. The story died in edits." "It didn't die," I said. "It was redirected." Daniel sat back slowly. "You think this goes beyond environmental risk?" "I think it already has," I replied. Thomas nodded. "I pulled insurance records. Claims were settled quietly. Non-disclosure agreements. Patterns again," Ruth said. "Always," I agreed. That afternoon, Daniel asked me to sit with him outside. The porch overlooked a stretch of dry land that dipped toward a narrow stream. Nothing dramatic, just water finding its way. "I need to tell you something," he said. I waited. "When I first reviewed the data," he continued, "I thought the worst outcome was structural failure, economic damage, delays. I think you've to view on. And now? Now I think they knew people could get hurt, and they decided that was acceptable." The words hung between us, heavy, permanent. "I don't know how I didn't see it sooner," he said. "I kept thinking in terms of standards, compliance." "That's because you're decent," I said. "They aren't." He nodded, then looked at his injured wrist. "If you hadn't come when you did." "You don't finish that sentence," I said. He didn't. That night, Miriam stayed up late, cross-referencing old field notes with public records. Around midnight, she called us all into the kitchen. "I found it," she said. Found what? Ruth asked. The missing link. She laid out a photocopy of a handwritten memo, dated 8 years earlier. It referenced sediment instability near the same bend in the river now under development. The memo recommended a halt pending further study. The author's name was familiar. Harold Knox, Daniel read aloud. And the recipient? Thomas asked. Miriam tapped the bottom of the page. Elaine Walker, back when she was just a junior board member. Silence followed. Not shock, confirmation. She's known from the beginning, Ruth said. Yes, Miriam replied. And she chose to proceed anyway. Daniel closed his eyes. So when she said I was being rigid, she was testing you, I said, seeing if you could be bent. End quote. And when I couldn't, he continued, she removed me. That's how the system maintains itself, Thomas said. It doesn't crush resistance, it reroutes it. I stared at the memo, at the handwriting, at the date. This changes things, I said. How? Ruth asked. It proves intent, I replied. Not negligence, not oversight, intent. The word settled differently than all the others. It carried weight, legal weight, moral weight. But it's still just paper, Daniel said. For now, I replied. The next morning, we heard the sound of machinery in the distance. Not close, but present. The river was being touched. Daniel stood at the window, jaw set. They're moving faster. Yes, I said, because they think they're winning. He turned to me. What if they're right? I met his gaze. Then they wouldn't be in such a hurry. That afternoon, Marianne called again. This time, Daniel answered. I know where you are, she said without preamble. Daniel said nothing. Elaine wants to make this right, Marianne continued. She's willing to discuss reassignment, a consulting role, compensation. Daniel laughed quietly. You mean silence? I mean peace, Marianne said. There's no peace built on lies, he replied. She exhaled sharply. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. No, he said. I'm making it accurate. When the call ended, Daniel sat very still. She knows, he said. Yes, I replied, and she still chose to call. That's desperation, Ruth said. I looked at the river beyond the trees, unseen but felt. They had known the truth for years. They had buried it under language and speed and confidence. They had accepted casualties as variables, and now, with the ground about to give way, they were offering deals. It was too late for that, because the truth, once mapped, does not disappear again. It waits, and we were done waiting. The call from Marianne changed something in Daniel, not in the way I expected. He did not become angrier. He became quieter, more precise, the kind of quiet that comes when denial finally gives way to understanding. That evening, he asked me to sit with him again at the kitchen table. The documents were spread out between us, weighed down at the corners with coffee mugs and a paperweight Ruth had found in a drawer. There's something I haven't told you, he said. I did not interrupt. When Elaine first reassigned my review, Marianne told me not to fight it, he continued. She said Elaine had a long memory, that pushing back would only make things harder later. And you listened, I said gently. Yes. For a while. He swallowed. But then I found the discrepancies. And I showed them to Marianne before I reported anything. The words settled slowly. She saw the data? I asked. She did, he said. Not everything, but enough. She understood what it meant. Hafe. I leaned back slightly. And what did she say? That I was overreacting, he replied. That these things are never as clean as textbooks make them. That real-world projects require compromise. Ruth, standing near the sink, turned sharply, so she knew people could get hurt. Yes, Daniel said, and she told me it wasn't my responsibility. The betrayal was not sharp. It was dull, heavy, the kind that presses down on you long after the moment passes. She didn't arrange what happened to you, I said carefully. No, he agreed. But she knew why it happened. Silence filled the room. Outside, wind moved through the trees, steady and unconcerned. I keep thinking, Daniel said quietly, that if I'd stayed quiet longer, none of this would have happened. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. That's how they survive, I said, by convincing decent people that truth is the problem. He nodded, eyes fixed on the papers. I'm married into that thinking. I thought proximity meant influence. It usually means absorption, I replied. Later that night, Ruth found something else. She had been tracing emergency response plans tied to the redevelopment area, looking for inconsistencies. They rerouted evacuation protocols, she said, tapping the screen of her tablet. Quietly, shifted responsibility to a private contractor. And if something goes wrong? I asked. Liability fragments, she replied. Everyone points somewhere else. Daniel closed his eyes. They planned for failure. Yes, I said. They just didn't plan to be caught planning for it. The next morning, Thomas arrived with news that tightened everything. An internal audit is scheduled, he said. Not public. Just a review. That's fast, Ruth noted. Too fast, Miriam said. They're trying to control the narrative before something leaks. Or before something breaks, Daniel added. We all knew what that meant. The window was closing. Not for them, but for us. That afternoon, I made a decision I had been avoiding. I called the state infrastructure ombudsman, not to accuse. Not yet. I asked procedural questions, clarifications, hypotheticals. What happens, I asked calmly, if a safety certification is signed by someone aware of unresolved risk? There was a pause on the line. That would constitute willful negligence, the man said. Possibly criminal. Why, great. Even if no harm has occurred yet? Intent matters, he replied. I thanked him and hung up. That evening, Daniel asked me something I had not expected. If this ends the way we think it might, he said, what happens to Marianne? I considered the question carefully. That depends on her choices. She's already made them, he said. Yes, I replied. But consequences have a way of clarifying things. The next day, Marianne showed up in Cedar Bluff. I saw her car from the window before she reached the door. I did not tell Daniel at first. I wanted to see her face when she realized where she was. She knocked once, then again. When I opened the door, she smiled reflexively, then stopped when she took in the room. The maps, the papers, the people she did not expect. Eleanor, she said, we need to talk. We are, I replied. Daniel came into the room and stood beside me. He did not invite her in. She stepped forward anyway, then hesitated. I didn't know it would go this far, she said quickly. Elaine didn't tell me everything. You knew enough, Daniel said. She looked at him, eyes shining. I was trying to protect us. By protecting her, he replied. She exhaled, frustrated. You don't understand how power works. I do now, he said. It works by testing who will look away. She turned to me. You're manipulating him. I shook my head. I'm standing with him. I'm May. Her face hardened then. If you proceed, Elaine won't stop. I know, I said. She has connections you can't imagine. I imagine them every day, I replied. Marianne looked around again, finally understanding that this was not a negotiation. You're choosing destruction, she said. No, I answered calmly. We're choosing exposure. She left without another word. After the door closed, Daniel sat down heavily. I loved her, he said. I know, I replied. And she loved the world she built more. Yes, I said. That night, as the river machinery continued in the distance, I wrote one final note in my notebook. Complicity is quieter than violence, but no less deadly. The story was no longer about Elaine Walker alone. It was about everyone who had known and stayed silent. And now, silence was no longer an option. We did not rush after Marianne left. That was the hardest part, knowing the moment demanded urgency but choosing restraint instead. Panic would have given them something to point at. Calm, documented movement would give them nothing. By the next morning, Ruth had finalized a timeline that ran parallel to the city's public narrative. On one side, press releases, permit updates, cheerful language about progress. On the other, internal memos, reassigned reviews, altered emergency protocols. When laid side by side, the gap between them was impossible to ignore. "This is where we apply pressure," Ruth said, tapping a section near the bottom of the page. "Not publicly, institutionally." "How?" Daniel asked. "By forcing someone higher to acknowledge receipt," she replied. Thomas leaned forward. "Not the city. Not the council." "No," I said. "The bond authority." Everyone looked at me. "They're underwriting this project," I continued. "Municipal bonds tied to redevelopment returns. They care about risk disclosure more than image. And they don't like surprises," Miriam added. "Especially documented ones," I said. That afternoon, I made the call. Not to accuse, to notify. I spoke carefully, precisely, using language I had used for decades. I referenced documents by date and code, asked procedural questions that required answers, not deflection. The man on the other end of the line was polite at first, then cautious, then very quiet. "I'll need you to send what you have," he said finally. "I will," I replied. With confirmation of receipt. There was a pause. "Understood." When I hung up, Daniel exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. "That's it?" he asked. "No," I said. "That's the beginning." We sent the packet that evening. Not everything, just enough. Chain of custody forms, the Knox memo, emergency protocol changes, no commentary, just facts. By the next morning, construction along the river slowed. Not stopped, slowed. Thomas arrived with news before noon. "They've called an emergency review," he said. "Closed door. Elaine is in the room." "And Harold Knox?" Ruth asked. "He's not," Thomas replied. "Not officially." Daniel stood by the window, watching clouds drift over the trees. "She's going to say this is all procedural." "She can," I said. "But now she has to say it on record." I'm sud. That afternoon, Elaine Walker called me directly. I did not answer. She left a voicemail, her voice tight but controlled. "Eleanor, this is unnecessary. You are misinterpreting complex data. We can resolve this quietly." I deleted it. An hour later, a second message arrived. Shorter. "You're putting people at risk." I stared at the phone for a long moment before turning it off. That evening, Miriam received a message from an editor she trusted. "Something's moving," she said. Quietly, "They're asking about old stories." I nodded. "Let them." The next day, the bond authority issued a request for clarification. Public, carefully worded, but visible. By noon, the city issued a statement affirming its commitment to safety and transparency. By evening, Elaine Walker canceled her public appearances. Daniel sat at the table, fingers tracing the edge of a map. "She's going to blame someone else." "Yes," I replied. "That's what people do when the ground shifts under them." "And if she comes for us?" I looked at him. She already did. That night, Ruth took the first watch. Thomas left before dawn to avoid patterns. Miriam worked late, cross-checking references. I lay awake, listening to the quiet house settle, thinking about how often I had told myself that staying within the system was enough. It was not. But knowing how the system worked was. By morning, the review had expanded. External consultants brought in. Language changed. Words like willful and prior knowledge began to appear. Daniel read the update silently, then looked up. "They're saying the oversight committee failed." "Yes," I said. "But Elaine chaired it." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "So now she's exposed." "Not yet," I said. "But she's visible." Visibility, I had learned, was the most dangerous state for someone used to operating unseen. The river flowed on, indifferent to statements and reviews. It did not care who signed what. It responded only to physics. Elaine Walker had built her career believing she could manage both. She was about to learn that truth does not negotiate. It arrives, and it leaves consequences behind. The river moved first, not dramatically, not the way news cameras like. It shifted overnight after a heavy rain upstream, the kind that would barely register in the city. By morning, the waterline had crept several feet closer to the temporary retaining structures, pressing where the soil was weakest. Nothing collapsed, nothing flooded, but sensors recorded stress exactly where Daniel had marked it on the map. Thomas called before sunrise. "They've got readings they can't explain away," he said, not without admitting they ignored prior warnings. I sat at the table, hands folded, listening to the house wake up around me. "Good," I said. "That forces the next step." By mid-morning, the site was closed. Officially for assessment, unofficially because too many eyes were now watching. Elaine Walker did not issue a statement. Instead, she requested a private meeting with the bond authority, the city manager, and 2 state-level advisors. Closed door, no press, no minutes released. Ruth shook her head when she heard. "She's going to offer a sacrifice." "Someone lower," Daniel said. "Yes," I replied. "But the problem she's facing now isn't blame. It's documentation." That afternoon, Miriam received a message that changed everything. "Harold Knox is panicking," she said, reading from her phone. "He's contacting former clients, asking what they know." "That's not confidence," Ruth observed. "No," I agreed. "That's fear." Knox had spent decades teaching others how to survive scrutiny. He knew the signs. He also knew when a system could no longer protect him. An hour later, Thomas arrived in person, face set. "Elaine didn't just ignore warnings," he said. "She altered advisory classifications." Daniel straightened. "That's not just procedural." "No," Thomas replied. "That's falsification." I closed my eyes briefly. "Where did you get that?" "From someone inside the review," he said. "Off the record." Ruth let out a slow breath. "That moves this out of administrative territory." "Yes," I said. "It does." That evening, Elaine Walker finally spoke publicly. She stood in front of a plain backdrop. No river, no skyline. Her voice was steady, practiced. "Recent assessments have raised questions about procedural consistency," she said. "I welcome a full and transparent review." She did not say safety. She did not say risk. She did not say responsibility. Daniel watched the clip twice. "She's distancing herself," he said. "Yes," I replied, "from the language. But not the actions," Ruth added. The final piece arrived unexpectedly. Late that night, Miriam called me into the kitchen. Her face was pale, eyes bright with focus. "I found something," she said. "Not about the river." "What then?" I asked. "About Elaine. It's draft." She laid a document on the table, a scanned copy of an old professional license application. "Her early career," Miriam continued. "She claimed experience she didn't have, oversight roles she never held." Daniel frowned. "That's not uncommon." "No," Miriam said. "But this is." She pointed to a certification number. "That belongs to someone else," she said. "Someone who died 15 years ago." Silence fell hard. "You're saying," Ruth began. "I'm saying Elaine Walker built her authority on credentials that were never hers," Miriam finished. "She didn't just hide risk, she hid herself." The room felt suddenly very still. "That explains everything," I said quietly. "Why she can't afford exposure, why she never lets scrutiny linger, and why Knox protected her," Thomas added. "He helped create her." Daniel sat down slowly. "So if this comes out, she loses everything," Ruth said. "Not just position, legitimacy, acting it. And every decision she ever signed becomes suspect," I added. "We did not celebrate. We did not smile. This was not victory. It was gravity asserting itself." The next morning, the bond authority issued a formal suspension of funding pending investigation. By noon, the city manager placed Elaine Walker on administrative leave. By evening, Harold Knox resigned from all advisory roles for personal reasons. Daniel stood by the window as news updates scrolled silently across the screen. "They're unraveling," he said. "Yes," I replied, "because the truth doesn't just expose actions, it exposes foundations." He turned to me. "What happens now?" I met his eyes. "Now the system does what it always does when it can no longer deny reality. It corrects," Ruth said. "Slowly," I added. "Painfully, but it corrects." That night, as rain fell again, the river held, not because of management, but because intervention finally arrived before it was too late. Elaine Walker had believed she could control outcomes by controlling information. She was wrong. Information, once verified, does not belong to anyone. It belongs to consequences. And those had finally arrived. The silence after Elaine Walker's suspension was not the kind that brings relief. It was heavy, expectant, like the pause before a storm decides whether to break or pass. News outlets reported the facts in cautious language. Administrative leave, review pending, no conclusions drawn. Everyone waited for someone else to speak first. Daniel read every update without comment. His body was healing, but his posture still carried the memory of impact. He moved carefully, as if the world itself had become unstable ground. "They're going to try to contain this," he said one evening, scrolling through an article. "Frame it as a procedural failure, one bad actor." "Yes," I replied. "They always do." "And Harold Knox?" "Still quiet," Ruth said, "which means he's negotiating." Negotiation was his specialty, but this time he was negotiating with history, not people. Miriam returned to the city briefly to check archives in person. When she came back, her expression told me enough. "They're scrubbing," she said. "Not deleting. Recontextualizing. Changing language," I said. "Yes," she replied. "Removing certainty. Adding ambiguity." "That won't hold," Ruth said. "Too many records already duplicated." "True," Miriam agreed. "But they're trying to decide who absorbs the damage." The answer came 2 days later. The city released a statement announcing a comprehensive restructuring of the River Renewal Council. Elaine Walker's role was described as symbolic, her authority advisory rather than operational. Responsibility was distributed among unnamed subcommittees. Daniel closed his laptop. "They're rewriting her significance." "They're trying to," I said. "But rewriting requires cooperation. And the bond authority won't cooperate," Ruth added. "They care about liability." That afternoon, my phone rang. "Unknown number," I answered. "Miss Price," a man said. "This is Deputy Attorney Lawson. I'm calling regarding the ongoing inquiry." "Yes," I replied. "We'd like to speak with you. And your son." "About what?" I asked calmly. "Prior knowledge," he said, "and attempted suppression." I looked at Daniel. He met my gaze and nodded. "We'll cooperate," I said. "Fully." After the call ended, Daniel exhaled slowly. "This is it." "Yes," I said. "This is the part where truth becomes formal." He sat back, eyes closing briefly. "I didn't want it to come to this." "I know," I replied. "But this isn't punishment. It's alignment." The interview took place 2 days later in a neutral building with no signage. Daniel spoke first. He did not embellish. He did not speculate. He described what he found, what he reported, and what happened after. When it was my turn, I spoke about patterns, about process, about how silence becomes policy if no one interrupts it. The deputy listened carefully, asked precise questions, took notes. At the end, he leaned back slightly. "You understand this will expand?" "Yes," I said. "And it may implicate people beyond Miss Walker." "Yes. Are you prepared for that?" I thought of my son on the concrete floor of the pump station, of the river pressing silently against its boundaries, of all the times I had signed documents trusting that someone else had done their job honestly. "Yes," I said. "I am." When we returned to Cedar Bluff, the house felt different, lighter somehow. Not because the danger had passed, but because its shape was finally visible. That night, Daniel sat across from me at the kitchen table. "I don't feel victorious," he said. "You shouldn't," I replied. "This isn't a game. I feel older." I smiled faintly. "That's what happens when illusions break." He nodded. "Do you regret getting involved?" "No," I said without hesitation. "Even knowing what it cost?" I reached for his hand, especially because of that experience. Outside, the river flowed quietly. Work crews had withdrawn. Barriers remained, temporary but attentive. The city was adjusting. Slowly, reluctantly, but adjusting. Elaine Walker did not issue another statement. Her name began to disappear from websites, from plaques, from programs. Absence can be louder than scandal if you know how to listen. Harold Knox was called to testify before a state committee. He declined at first, then accepted. His confidence did not translate well under oath. Consequences unfolded not with drama, but with accumulation. And in that accumulation, something rare happened. The truth stayed put. It did not get softened. It did not get redirected. It simply remained, solid and unavoidable. That was justice enough. Spring arrived quietly in Cedar Bluff. The trees along the gravel road began to bud, tentative at first, then confident. Daniel could walk without pain now. The splint was gone. The bruises had faded to pale yellow shadows that only appeared in certain light. His body had healed faster than his sense of certainty. But that, too, was returning in pieces. We did not return to the city right away. There was no urgency. The hearings were scheduled. The investigations had their own momentum now, moving forward without us needing to push. That was an unfamiliar feeling, but not an unwelcome one. One morning, Daniel stood at the edge of the property watching the stream swell with snowmelt. "I used to believe," he said, "that if you followed the rules closely enough, they would protect you." "They protect order," I replied. "Not people." He nodded. "I don't think I can go back to the job the way it was." "You don't have to," I said. "Nothing forces us to return to old shapes." He smiled faintly. "You sound like you planned this." "I plan to be ready," I said. "There's a difference." Marianne sent one final message. It was brief, careful. She said she hoped he was well and that she was moving on. There was no apology, no explanation. Daniel read it once and deleted it without comment. That, too, was a kind of closure. A month later, the state released its preliminary findings. Language was still cautious, but firm. Prior knowledge, misrepresentation of credentials, willful negligence. Elaine Walker resigned permanently. Her licenses were suspended pending review. Harold Knox's testimony contradicted documented evidence. His credibility did not survive the week. The city announced a full reassessment of river-adjacent developments. Funding was redirected. Projects paused. New oversight introduced, this time with names attached. Daniel read the announcement slowly, then looked up. "They're saying the risk was known," he said. "Yes," I replied, out loud. He let out a breath he had been holding for months. We returned to the city in early summer. The apartment on the north side felt smaller than before, but familiar. I reopened windows. Daniel moved his things out of storage. Life resumed, not where it had left off, but somewhere adjacent. He declined an offer to return to his old department. Instead, he accepted a position with an independent review board, one that required him to travel and question assumptions. It suited him. As for me, I did not return to work. I had already done my part. But I did accept an invitation to advise, quietly, on procedural reforms. I chose my engagements carefully. I no longer needed to be everywhere. One afternoon, I walked along the river path downtown. Construction barriers remained, but so did signs explaining why. People stopped to read them. Some shook their heads, others nodded. The river flowed within its banks, unbothered by recognition. I thought back to the moment I found my son in that abandoned pump station. The hum of emergency lights, the calm in his voice as he said she had signed the report anyway. At the time, it felt like the end of something. It wasn't. It was the beginning of clarity. Power, I had learned, does not come from position or reputation. It comes from understanding when to speak and when to wait. From knowing that truth, once documented and shared with care, outlasts intimidation. Everything I believed about safety, about institutions, about family had been tested. Some things collapsed, others proved stronger than I expected. I no longer believed that silence was neutral. I no longer believed that progress justified omission. And I no longer believed that ordinary people were powerless. Daniel joined me on the path, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed for the first time in a long while. "Do you think they'll remember this?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Not because of the names, because of the consequences." He nodded, satisfied. As we walked, the river reflected the late afternoon light, steady and contained, not because it had been forced into obedience, but because it had finally been respected. That was the difference, and it was one worth everything it had taken to learn.